We warned you in a past video here on VisualPolitik. South Korea's new president, the conservative Yoon Seok-yeol, is turning out to be a political earthquake. Since he took over the presidency, not a week goes by without Yoon announcing some major change in the country. Of course, given the track record of South Korean presidents, when it comes to keeping their promises, we will have to keep a close eye on what is finally done and not done. After all, in the history of South Korean democracy, presidents fulfill on average around 30% of their election pledges. Because yes, in South Korea, these things are counted. Former President Moon, for example, met just 17% according to provisional data. Of course, we are talking about statistics, and that doesn't always work in politics. Not all commitments carry the same weight. Be that as it may, the fact that President Yoon does not come from professional Korean politics may make his statistics much better. For now, if there is one thing we can say, it is that the guy looks like he's got the drive. For the time being, the vision of South Korea that the new president seems to want to create is quite different from the one left by former President Moon. Now, do you want to know exactly what the first steps are that Yoon is taking to revive South Korea? Could they be the gateway to a new economic takeoff? What does this president's promised shift to the right consist of in practice? Well, in this video, we will answer these and other questions. VisualPolitik fans, South Korea's political system is presidential, but perhaps one of its most notable characteristics is that legislative and presidential elections do not coincide on the same date. That is, the country's president may have to govern without a majority in parliament. This is precisely the scenario that Yoon Seok-yeol encountered, specifically between 10th of May 2022, when he assumed the presidency, and April 2024. He will have no choice but to govern with a hostile parliament. This means that for at least 2 of the 5 years of his mandate, the president may be tied hand and foot if he does not get the support of the opposition in the National Assembly. Or that during this time, he decides to govern more or less by presidential decree, which is exactly what seems to be going to happen. In South Korea, the legislative chamber is not required to approve each and every presidential decree, which gives the president broad powers, basically allowing him to introduce major changes without the need to reach a large consensus. And although in the long run these measures can be easily reversed, they can have important consequences on the political, economic, and social life of the country. For the time being, the first proposals and the first changes are already here. Judge for yourselves.
More market and less state?
As we already mentioned in the last video about the turnaround in South Korea, if there is one thing that categorizes Yoon, it is that he does not like anything, absolutely anything that carries the slightest whiff of left-wing politics, neither socially nor economically, or so he says. Be that as it may, it is in the economic area where most changes are expected to take place in the coming years, and they are so important. What do you want me to say? We are obliged to tell you about them on VisualPolitik. Well, first of all, the new president has already announced the central measures of his 5-year economic plan. They are already public, so we are not talking about promises or imaginings, but about firm intentions. And among them, reducing regulations on business activity and lowering taxes are the clear protagonists.
Regulations and schemes that undermine business competitiveness and discourage entrepreneurship will be drastically improved. The current economic circumstance inside and outside the country are very serious. In times of crisis, we need to make changes to be more market-orientated and have the private sector drive the entire economy. Yoon Seok-yeol.
In fact, both Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho and other ministers have made it very clear in a statement that the core of the Yoon government's economic plan will be deregulation above all else. The new economic plan commits the government to minimizing state intervention in the market and to promoting a change in the economic model towards one in which private sectors and companies are the dominant players. Likewise, the plan also includes reducing the top corporate tax rate from 25% to 22%, the same level as it was in 2018, thus reversing the increases led by Moon Jae-in. Also, and importantly, a revision of the tax system is proposed to introduce a tax exemption for profits repatriated to South Korea. The aim is to resolve once and for all the problem of double taxation on the activities of South Korean companies abroad. And that's not the end of it. Yoon, naturally, also wants more entrepreneurship and startups to be created in South Korea. So in order to achieve this, his idea is to grant greater tax credits. For example, by extending exemptions for stock options, a form of employee compensation that consists of the delivery of shares in the company's own stock. From the current threshold of 50 million won, the new government wants to quadruple the tax exemption to 200 million won, about $154,000. In other words, if you are compensated in shares up to that amount, you would not be taxed. With this, the government hopes to attract more highly qualified workers to the startups, and that they will be able to be paid a good chunk of their salary in shares instead of cash. The company wins, the workers win, and the government wins if it increases the number of startups. And don't forget that we're talking about South Korea. In this country, people dream of working in large conglomerates thanks to the high salaries, which allows the large companies to behave as a kind of talent vacuum cleaner that damages the competitiveness of small companies that are generally underdeveloped. We've already told you about the enormous problem of duality that South Korea has in this area. They are almost two different countries. Then, another of the economic measures announced is the modification of the inheritance tax. And take note, because this is not a minor issue. Those of you who have been following us for a while on VisualPolitik may have already seen this video, but for those of you who haven't, I think these headlines say quite a lot.
An inheritance tax bill you can't fathom, $10.8 billion. The Samsung family in South Korea will also donate billions of dollars worth of art, including Picasso and Monet. High inheritance tax hampering entrepreneurship.
And VisualPolitik fans, although South Korea has one of the lowest fiscal pressures in the OECD, dying on the other hand can be very, very expensive, provided that is that you have money. Because according to the Korean National Tax Service, only 2.9% of the heirs of deceased persons had to pay this tax in 2020. But if we're talking about a tax that in South Korea can be up to 50%, even between parents and children, following a progressive scale with deductions in the best income tax style. Now do you understand why the heirs of Lee Kun-hee, the former chairman of Samsung Group, which is the country's largest business conglomerate, have to face such a hefty bill? Well, although this tax mainly affects people who have a lot of money, whether you think it is fair or not is up to you. It is true that its impact on the economy can be considerable. You see, since major business conglomerates in South Korea are family owned and therefore inherited, when someone passes away, the bill can be so high that it can end up affecting the company itself when it comes to undertaking new investments or hiring workers. For example, the heirs may end up going into debt to pay the tax by pledging company resources as collateral. And above all, this encourages many people to take money out of the country and start businesses abroad. Well, whether you like it or not, this is something that Yoon wants to change. But even he doesn't seem to know exactly how he's going to do it. Apart from the measure just mentioned, Yoon's plan also includes other very important tax measures, such as the abolition of capital gains tax for all investors whose profits do not exceed $15,500 per year. In return, the idea is to apply a small tax on those holding more than $7.7 million in shares. It would also allow the postponement of gift tax payments in the case of receiving a business from a family member, and tax incentives for investments in strategic technologies, such as semiconductors, will be extended. Well, this is how Yoon wants to make the South Korean economy much more competitive and possibly able to weather the crisis that seems to be looming. But wait a minute, because the tax measures are far from the only changes Yoon wants to push through. There is much more to his flagship plan to restore South Korea to its former momentum. Listen up.
The 180-degree turn.
VisualPolitik fans, the change Yoon has in mind is not just about lowering 4 taxes and leaving it at that. Nothing could be further from the truth. The new president wants to make a U-turn on some of the most controversial and sensitive matters, such as energy policy and pensions. For example, Yoon seems ready to fulfill one of his big promises, one of the star proposals of his campaign, to bet heavily on nuclear energy. In fact, the Prime Minister has already announced a preview of the plan that seeks to meet the carbon neutrality target by 2050. But instead of doing so with renewables as the main source, he wants nuclear power to be the main player and renewables to be the backup.
Yoon calls for rational energy mix.
What he means by rational above all is that Moon's former plan for decarbonisation seems anything but realistic. The previous government's model combines the progressive closure of nuclear plants with a wild commitment to renewables. The problem is that in order to carry it out, the weight of renewables had to increase to between 61 and 71% of the energy mix, something that most experts consider simply not feasible. On the other hand, the new government has already announced that it will resume construction of the 2 nuclear reactors cancelled by the previous government of Moon Jae-in, and that it will also extend the useful life of those that are nearing their limit. And that's not all. It also plans to launch the construction of several new nuclear reactors to increase the share of nuclear energy in electricity production from 27.1% to 34% in the medium term. It will also seek to introduce small modular reactors, or SMRs, which are emerging as major players in the future of nuclear power into the country. The government will continue to support the deployment of renewable energies, however. The ultimate goal is to eliminate gas and coal-fired power generation, which currently account for 66% of South Korea's energy mix, by 2050. Then on the issue of housing, the economic plan envisages reducing taxes on landlords so that they can reduce the prices of rent and jeons, the peculiar South Korean rental system based on a gigantic rental deposit but without a monthly fee.
As short-term risks remain in the lease market, the government seeks to make preemptive responses by extending tax and financial benefits and boosting supplies. Chu Kyung-ho, Finance Minister.
On this last matter, on the supply side, the government has pledged to soon unveil a plan to build 2.5 million new homes in the country. We shall see. But perhaps the most delicate reform of all is precisely that of pensions. You see, South Korea is the country with the most accelerated demographic aging in the OECD, and its current pension model, based on a funded system through a public pension fund, is not expected to be able to cope with the number of pensioners in the near future. President Yoon himself has clearly stated that, in his opinion, the current model is a burden for future generations. Therefore, among other measures, he wants to increase the minimum retirement age from 60 to 65, or even eliminate the retirement age, or grant benefits to companies to rehire retirees, what is known as active retirement. And take note, because this is no joke. According to the South Korean Statistics Office, the working age population will shrink by more than 35% over the next 3 decades, a phenomenon that threatens to sink production, while public spending could skyrocket, not only in pensions, but also in health and social services. But this topic is so significant that we will dedicate an upcoming video specifically to it. But that does not mean that we are absolutely finished. I've already told you that this new president has come in with a vengeance.
Public institution reform is a task that cannot be delayed any further. Public institution evaluations must be conducted strictly. Finances must only be used where they are needed, and financial resources must be spent kindly and generously on the truly social weak who desperately need government support. Yoon Seok-yeol.
We will see how that all turns out. For the time being, what has also changed radically has been the foreign policy. Now much closer to the United States and Japan, and more belligerence towards China and North Korea, which has meant abandoning the equidistance of the previous Moon government on major foreign policy issues. Take a look at this.
Biden, Yoon, mull more military exercises amid North Korea tensions. South Korea's alignment with US at odds with China, analysts say. As a new South Korean government deepens the nation's economic and security ties with the United States, experts are warning that Seoul's long-standing relationship with China is likely to suffer. As soon as possible, we have to go back to the best days of Korea and Japan. Unless we achieve that, even though we are talking about the future of Asia, I don't think it's realistic. Yoon Duk-min, new South Korean ambassador to Japan.
Well, I think with all that we have told you, the question is clear. Do you think that if all these measures are really implemented, South Korea could once again experience a new economic takeoff? Do you think these measures are enough to restore the country's competitiveness at home and abroad? Leave us your answers below. And now, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like it and subscribe to VisualPolitik to keep up to date with all our news. Once again, thank you very much for being there. All the best. I'll see you next time.